All right, next we're covering the Austral Realm, which consists of essentially Australia and New Zealand. So we've covered most recently Southeast Asia, and now we're kind of moving out into the ocean. We'll be covering the Pacific Realm, which is kind of the remainder of the ocean. But first, the book divides this Pacific area into two parts, the Austral Realm and the Pacific Realm. And so the Austral Realm is simply Australia and New Zealand. And one reason to divide them that way is they're both physical and cultural. They have a long history of migration from European countries, and they're both relatively large land masses out in the ocean. Make sure you understand the concepts, ideas, and terms from the chapter. We'll go over maybe a little bit, but not too much. But what we don't go over, just make sure you understand what those terms mean. This is a figure showing Australia and New Zealand, and one thing they both have in common is that they are island countries, and so they don't have any borders with other countries, no land borders anyway. That can be advantageous in some ways, that you don't have any border disputes. Your borders are quite clear for Australia and New Zealand. Both were part of the British Empire and settled primarily. They had people, Aboriginal or Maori people originally, and then large numbers of settlers from Europe later on. I'll include a film that talks about some of that migration history. Just a little bit of a size comparison. This is a figure that shows the relative size of the United States, at least the lower 48, compared to Australia and New Zealand. It also kind of illustrates the distance from New Zealand to Australia. That one thing to kind of understand is that New Zealand is not really that close to Australia. They're both out in the ocean, but New Zealand is much further from Asia than Australia is. Australia is much closer to the Asian mainland. And the other thing to note here is Australia is roughly the size of the lower 48 United States. A little bit on the physical environments. We've looked at this figure before, looking at the plate tectonics in the Pacific Ring of Fire. We made a comparison in the Southeast Asian chapter between the island of Borneo and the island of Java. And one thing we noted is that Borneo is not on the Ring of Fire. It is kind of in the middle of this tectonic plate. It is relatively old and relatively stable, where the island of Java is more volcanic. It is more mountainous and relatively new in terms of geologic history. And that same comparison can be made of Australia and New Zealand. Australia is a very old continent, and it was a piece of, it was a piece of land that broke away from other continents a long time ago, and it has been relatively geologically stable because it is not on one of these plate boundaries, whereas New Zealand here is. So New Zealand is a land with more earthquakes, volcanoes. It is very tectonically active, and it is right along the Pacific Ring of Fire. If we look at the climate in this part of the world, one thing about Australia is that most of Australia is relatively dry. It has a large desert in the interior, a bit wetter and sort of dry tropical environments in the north. And as we go to the south, it's actually quite wet, a little bit like Oregon or Washington. And then it has a Mediterranean climate in the south, which would be similar to California. So kind of like California in the south, Oregon, Washington in the east here. And New Zealand is kind of like Oregon and Washington too. It's far enough south that it'd be like Northern California, Oregon. It's as far south as Northern California is north. Additionally, it is more mountainous than Australia is. Probably better to illustrate this with a couple of pictures. This is a photograph of the interior of Australia. A couple things to note: relatively flat, not super mountainous, and relatively dry. So this is Australia, kind of get that as a picture in your head of the interior. This is a picture of the interior of New Zealand. So from the from Australia, relatively flat, relatively dry, to the much more mountainous and wetter environments in New Zealand. Now Australia does have some parts of it that are wetter and get more rainfall, but just to give us a real stark comparison of most of Australia versus most of New Zealand. New Zealand, being on the Ring of Fire, has volcanic activity and earthquakes, much more mountainous. So New Zealand is fairly mountainous and Australia is fairly dry, especially in the interior. And both of these do not have heavy populations that are spread throughout the country. This tan color means very low population. So both of these countries are sparsely populated, meaning that they do have some urban areas with concentrations of people, and then large vast of mountainous areas or deserts that don't have that many people. For example, the capital of Sydney, the capital of Australia, over 1/5 of Australians just live in that single urban area. And there's a few other urban areas scattered about, especially on the coast, where most of the population lives. Similar situation in New Zealand as well, that in a few urban areas around the periphery, most of the population lives there. So just a little bit of a kind of rough comparisons for us in the United States. Australia is similar in size to the US, 48 states, excluding Alaska. But their population is around 23 million. So that's a little less than 10% of the United States, actually a bit less. But just so we can have kind of rough idea about, about the same size, but less than 1/10 of the people. So Australia is big like the US, but not hardly as many people, less than 1/10 as many people live there. Low population. That's lower than the population of California, just for reference. New Zealand, it's a rough comparison, but it's kind of, if you squint your eyes, kind of roughly comparable to the state of California in size, but with a population of around 4 million. That's just over 10% of the 36 million people who live in California. So Australia, about the size of the US, about 10%. New Zealand, about the size of California, but about 10%. Just to give you kind of a rough comparison of the size versus population. Now, people did live, before European settlement, people did live in both of these places. However, there is some key differences, and the main difference is when they arrived in these places in Australia, and the second difference is the relative percentage of the overall population. In Australia, we have the Aboriginal people. They arrived a long time ago. This is one of the earliest migrations in human history. Exactly how the details, exactly how they made it to Australia are somewhat of a mystery still, but they arrived about 50,000 years ago, which was way back during the ice ages. One thing about the ice ages is sea levels were lower, and so that helped to gave them the ability to walk a lot closer to Australia than you could today, and then they somehow bridged that gap of ocean to make it there. In New Zealand, the Aboriginal people of New Zealand are the Maori. Recently, about 1,000 years ago, when Polynesian sailors began, and we're going to talk more about them, began, going from island to island, sailing from island to island to island. So they came to New Zealand through sailing technology. At the end of the course, we're going to end on talking about some of that sailing technology that allowed people to conquer the Pacific Ocean. And New Zealand was part of that conquest, which happened much more recently with technological innovations in sailing ships by the Polynesians. The other difference is the relative percentage of the population. The Aboriginal people are about 3% of the Australian population. They might make up they're a smaller minority, whereas the Maori are a larger minority of New Zealand. They make up about 13% of the country. It's kind of not exact, but it'd be like if we talked about the United States, maybe the percentage of Latino population would be comparable to the percentage of Maori population. And the reason I say that is to highlight that because they're over 10% of the population compared to 3% of the Aboriginal, they tend to have more political power in New Zealand because of the size of their numbers compared to the population overall. Just a couple of figures showing the movement of people into the Pacific. So these dashed lines represent migrations during the ice ages, a long time, tens of thousands of years ago. And then much later, through sailing technology, Polynesian people expanded into places like Hawaii and other places, and that included to New Zealand. This next figure shows it a little bit on a more global scale. Humans originated in Africa, and some of the earliest migrations out of Africa were around here to Australia about as early as 65,000 years ago and then later. Whereas migrations to the islands, such as New Zealand, happened more at the scale of about 1,000 years ago. We talked about Madagascar near Africa. That's part of the same migrations where people went to Madagascar, were also part of the migrations that got people to New Zealand and even to places like Hawaii. Now, how did people get there to Australia so early? Well, part of it is that when sea levels were lower, this is Southeast Asia, that more land was exposed because sea levels were lower. And so you could get a little bit, you could kind of, go from island to island to island to island. Australia was not as cut off from Asia as it is today with higher sea levels. So that helps to explain that possibility of getting there. But it's still kind of an amazing journey because you still would have to travel over some open ocean. Now, currently, then both became part of the British Empire early on. British settlers, including prisoners and other people, were sent to Australia, and other migrants went also to New Zealand, but focusing on Australia now, the bigger one. It was a British colony, and it also enforced a whites-only policy, meaning that only European migration was permitted into Australia for a very long time, until the 1970s. And this kind of excluded people from the nearby Asian countries. And that is no longer true, that since the 1970s, when those policies have gone away, that Australia has had a much greater migration from nearby Asian countries, East Asia, East Asia like China, South Asia like India, Pakistan, and Southeast Asian countries which are nearby, including places like Vietnam, the Philippines, and so on, Indonesia. And because of the amount of migration, that Australia truly is a nation of immigrants. About a quarter of their population is foreign born. And we think of the United States as a nation of immigrants, but only about 10% of our population is foreign born. So even like 2.5 times that in Australia. And lastly, the one thing, although there's not many people, there is a lot of natural resources. There's a lot of grazing activity. There's modern farming that happens in Australia. Australia in some ways is kind of like a really big California in some ways, but it also has significant natural resources, including things like iron ore. This is a big pit where they're doing iron ore mining. And we've talked about how countries like China have been expanding rapidly and have a real need for products like steel. And Australia is one of the places that's near Asia that has a lot of these raw materials. And so they've become much more integrated with the Asian economies, especially because they're able to provide raw materials like steel and other things.